Welcome to Iron 2's Innovation and Insight series, where we talk to thought leaders who are shaping the future of our industry. My name's Adam Burr, and I'm a political researcher at Iron 2, and I'm joined by my colleague Rebecca Tapan, who is a research and analysis manager within the team. Today we're thrilled to have a very special guest joining us, Jennifer Howe, a policy researcher. Her research focuses on various forms of political violence like genocide, conflict, extremism, which she explores through a gendered lens. She's currently doing a PhD at King's College London in the Department of War Studies, which focuses on women who participate in genocide.
Jackie True's like a real expert on women, peace and security. She and a team of researchers surveyed individuals across Indonesia, the Philippines and Bangladesh, and they found that holding misogynistic beliefs made someone 3 times more likely to support extremist ideology, and it was a greater determinant than your religious background, family background.
Jennifer, welcome to Iron 2. How are you?
I'm good, yeah, it's great to be here. Great to have all my work kind of presented and
yeah,
stuff, so.
We really enjoyed going through it. Me and Rebecca, we shared it around with other people as well. So thank you for everything. But I guess Rebecca, do you want to kick it off?
Yeah, I can go first. So we just wanted to ask you to start by introducing yourself and your work, and pointing us towards some of the latest projects that you've been working on.
Yeah, no problem. So as Adam said, I'm a War Studies PhD student at King's College London. Coming to the end of my PhD, still kind of tying it up and trying to do the edits and things. I mean, my background's very firmly in the kind of women, peace and security policy research space. So in the various positions I've held, so as a parliamentary researcher and also working at Pacific Forum, which is a US-based think tank, which I worked for on and off since before I even started my PhD. I've focused a lot on women, peace and security, and in particular on that kind of intersection between gender, conflict and extremism. What I'm most interested in essentially is why individual perpetrators engage in conflict and extremism and how gender intersects with that and drives their motives. So that's really kind of encapsulates my background and interests.
Yeah. What shaped your approach to the topic?
Really, I think the interest comes from the fact that my career and my research interests really come from a desire to understand how various forms of politically motivated violence emerge and why people become involved in them. And so I found gender to be a really useful tool for understanding this. So looking at things like the roles that women and men perform in extremist groups and non-state armed groups and the similarities temporally, historically and also geographically, I found very interesting. And I thought as well, like any kind of approach that you can take that provides some kind of predictive power for understanding human behaviour, especially in violent scenarios, is really, really useful. And I think gender does that. It's an incredibly important predictive tool in finding these kind of similarities across different contexts. So that was what interested me about it.
No, it does sound fascinating, and I think since you've mentioned the women, peace and security agenda, could you walk us through exactly what that means? I know in your work you mentioned that it has 4 pillars. So we have participation, prevention, protection, and relief and security. So could you walk us through the pillars and also maybe which one you lean more into when you're doing your work?
Sure, yeah. So the Women, Peace and Security agenda it's sort of made up by various Security Council resolutions, but the first one to be passed and kind of the core of this agenda is the UN Security Council Resolution 1325, which was passed in 2000. And really the agenda and the resolution focus on and come from a place of trying to understand how conflict affects women uniquely because of their gender. And it emerged, at least in part, because in the 1990s there were conflicts like during the breakup of Yugoslavia and also the Rwandan genocide, where widespread sexual violence used against women was reported by the media. And so this kind of drew attention to the fact that women and girls are deeply affected by sexual violence in conflict. And so the agenda was created, at least in part, in response to that. And the 4 different pillars focus on not just protecting women and girls from violence in conflict, and also addressing some of the inequalities they face during conflict economically as well, and socially, and in terms of education and this type of thing. But it's also about encouraging participation, encouraging women to enter into these decision-making roles politically and in security sector positions as well, with the idea behind that being that having more women in those roles could lead to a more equitable and stable society and potentially prevent conflict further down the line. So it's a very intricate framework for understanding and addressing conflict and other forms of crises like now climate change.
Yeah.
And I know you asked about the pillars. So the first pillar, participation, essentially calls for women's participation in politics, peace building, and in the security sector, so in peacekeeping forces, military forces, police too, and security and intelligence roles kind of more broadly. And then protection is about protecting women and girls from gender-based violence and other harms that occur during conflicts. Prevention is kind of twofold. So the first part of that looks to again, prevent sexual violence and other gendered harms to women and girls during conflict, but it is also about preventing conflict more generally by encouraging women and girls to enter into, or women rather, to enter into these more kind of decision-making roles. And then relief and recovery was added a bit later, and this focuses more on kind of the aftermath of conflicts and conflicts and climate-related disasters, and how you can encourage women to be part of the kind of policy creation for those, and also about kind of recognising the gendered impacts of climate change and conflicts more generally.
Yeah, and a lot of that marries up with the work that we do at IN too as well, and some of the work that you do, Rebecca, as well, right?
Yeah, we look a lot at that relief and recovery phase, particularly in post-conflict or early recovery societies. We're always really interested, especially when some of the societies that we might be looking at, they have a general absence of men, you know, especially men are impacted by conflicts in other ways. So we quite often find that they're in detention, potentially some have died, and so women and children do tend to bear the brunt of the relief and recovery process in those really early years. So the next thing I wanted to ask you was that a lot of your work and your application of the 4 pillars is on Southeast Asia, and I was really fascinated by that because as someone who works on MENA, when you say conflict, women and violence, you quite often think about, you know, the Middle East, North Africa, potentially even South America. So I was wondering if you could tell the listeners why you chose to focus on Southeast Asia and how that is related to some of the themes of your work.
So I think, again, this was kind of by chance. So I ended up by visiting Cambodia at the end of my undergraduate degree because I was working on behalf of my university there. And I was really interested in the kind of political system in the country because it was during the 2018 national elections. And so there was quite widespread political violence and also conversations around the political system and the electoral system and how kind of problematic it is. Historically, looking at the 20th century and on, it's a region that's faced so much change and a lot of diversity. So obviously there's been kind of conflicts there between communist ideology and more authoritarian ideology. And I was really curious about the kind of the differences in these conflicts and the ideologies behind them. But I also think it's really important to remember with Southeast Asia that there's some really positive examples that come from the region. So, for instance, Cambodia was obviously faced a huge period of mass violence and is now a very kind of peaceful country. That's not to say there aren't problems there, but, you know, it's not really drawn on a lot as an example of somewhere that has overcome intense violence. And they didn't just have the genocide, they also endured basically from the 1960s to the 1990s war, a civil war in the country. And so there's this real kind of, and it's not just Cambodia, it's also Aceh, Timor-Leste as well. These are all places that have had, you know, very long-running conflicts and have overcome those conflicts. And I think there's a lot that can be said and kind of learnt from looking at those settings and those contexts. And then I think, beyond that, there's also been mass democratization in the region from the 1980s and economic growth. And I just felt like there was so much to look into there. Obviously, a lot of the countries have faced decolonialism as well. And that's another side of kind of looking at their history as well and understanding how that impacted, post-colonial conflicts. And I think it's just a region that is also massively kind of overlooked in, maybe not so much in the US, but certainly in, I'd say, British academia and actually British policy making more generally. And you always hear about this kind of shift or pivot to the Indo-Pacific that goes on, or that the British government is hoping to kind of do post-Brexit. But there's still just very limited research and understanding of the region, I'd say. And so, yeah, this was just like a kind of real interest in the political history and diversity of it is what caused me to focus on it as a region.
And I think a lot of your work really bleeds over to other regions, like you said, like, you know, especially some of the indicators and some of the specific events that have happened in Cambodia in regards to the civil war and recent genocide, and going through long, turbulent periods of instability is replicated in a lot of the work that we do in other parts of the world as well.
And you mentioned in passing, you mentioned Aceh, which I believe is in Indonesia, is that correct?
Yes, yeah, it is.
So when we read through your work, you had one really interesting line that I will just read as a quote for people listening, and I wondered if you could tell us some context about Aceh. So I'll read the quote. A study conducted in 2019, which was 14 years after the cessation of hostilities in Aceh, found that war widows in the province are still reeling from the effects of the insurgency. So could you tell us firstly about the conflict, secondly about the impact on women, and obviously we're now in 2024, so what is the situation for women like now?
So Aceh was a conflict, like you said, in Indonesia. It's a province in Sumatra, actually one of the Indonesian islands. And the conflict occurred between 1976 and 2005. It was essentially caused by kind of religious differences, cultural differences in the province, between the province and the government in Jakarta. It ended in 2005 after the tsunami, the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, which really affected Aceh in particular. And so efforts kind of turned from fighting essentially to relief and recovery and reconstruction. And so it's been peaceful since then, but it's also a kind of semi-autonomous region, so it gained that status. The leader of Indonesia for most of the conflict was Suharto, who was enacted essentially a very brutal military rule that had very limited freedoms, and so this also kind of fed into the conflict. There was a lot of violence committed by both parties in the conflict, so both the non-state armed groups who were seeking independence and also the Indonesian government-backed forces. I believe about tens of thousands of people died during this conflict. And in the aftermath, there's been quite an amount of research done on women war widows, so women whose husbands died during the conflict. The main issue really, and this is something that occurs across lots of different conflicts, is that you get high rates of male mortality, which leaves a lot of women without husbands because their husbands have died in battle. And the economic systems that are in place and educational systems make it difficult for those women to then gain kind of secure employment. They maybe don't have high levels of education. They might be restricted from being in the public sphere as well, which adds to this sense of struggling to find a job essentially. And then to add to that, social security for single mothers can be very difficult anyway, but then if you're dealing with a situation that's feeling the effects of a conflict and trying to reconstruct after decades long conflict, it's really difficult to administer social assistance. And so this is all kind of part of the issue for women who are widowed by conflict in Aceh and elsewhere. And I think also with Aceh, what was quite interesting is they have, and also another group that has been marginalised strongly in the post-conflict reconstruction is the women who joined as combatants. And essentially women combatants were overlooked in the combatant reintegration programmes in Aceh, essentially because they were stigmatised within their local communities for diverging from gender norms in joining a combatant force. And so a lot of them were kind of overlooked in these processes unless they had family connections to the combatant forces in Aceh.
Well, I was going to say, I think it's really interesting what you were saying, a couple of points really. One, that the tsunami ultimately ended the conflict and how, one crisis can really lead in some strange way to a period of cessation and reintegration and this transition. So I thought that was really something I hadn't considered at all, that, you know, a humanitarian crisis could actually be in some way a unifying figure.
I do want to ask a question just a little bit focused on women in conflict and that participate in conflict zones, because we see that a lot in the MENA region, particularly in areas in northern Syria and historically in the fight against ISIS and Daesh. You know, and maybe for Rebecca as well, really, like what type of things do you see in Jennifer's work that you think that could resonate?
Well, I think you discussed the way that they're often, firstly overlooked by the processes, because there's not a clear space for them. So I think they fall victim sometimes to these stereotypes of women on both sides, because they're not at home caring for the children necessarily, which might be expected of them. And then they don't have a natural place in the combatant space either. And so their gender itself is a barrier to potentially reintegrating them in some way. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And I think you mentioned the stigma that the female combatants face. So what does it look like for a former female combatant to try re-enter society? Is it stigma from friends, neighbours? Is there this need to maybe distance yourself from them? And is this also structural? So is this built into the economic systems and the political systems as well?
So, I mean, I think I can actually talk a little bit about my PhD fieldwork here, because I came across a number of women who actually served in the Khmer Rouge and are now widowed and living quite kind of separately from, I guess, the rest of society in a way. And I think what I noticed with them, and I'm not an expert on reintegration per se, so I'd strongly encourage to read maybe some of the work that focuses on all the kind of dynamics behind that. But what I noticed is that for them, it was very much about kind of that there was no social support in place from the government. And that's the case with a lot of I mean, everyone in Cambodia essentially has not received any kind of restitution or assistance from the government in the wake of the genocide there. But for women who were widowed, and a lot of them were kind of, that I spoke to anyway, were former members of the Khmer Rouge because their husbands were involved in the Khmer Rouge, and so they ended up being killed in the conflict that followed the collapse of the regime in the 1980s and 90s. And they would say to me, it's been really difficult for me, or some of them converted to Christianity because the church would offer them some money for their children, and they said I needed to feed my children, so this is what I converted to Christianity. And for me the kind of overwhelming factor was more the state and what the state was doing or what the state wasn't doing to support them. But social stigma is also an issue as well, and I think that in this case there's obviously anger because some of these people did commit really major atrocities. I think a lot of them do face this stigma as a result of their actions during the Civil War. But I think with women, it's kind of another layer of stigma beyond what men might face, because there's the gendered component there.
I think it resonates a lot with the stuff that we see in MENA as well, like in regards to that, especially in regards to women that participated or had close husbands or partners that were involved in the violence and that lost their lives, and then that kind of elevating that role of the woman in the household to kind of hold things together. Moving on to a slightly different topic, but the same paper, you talked about how individuals who support violence against women were 3 times more likely to support extremism than those that did not hold those views in Southeast Asian companies. Can you explain some of the case studies in regards to that, or just a little bit about that topic?
So that was drawn from True et al.'s research at Monash University, which is a university in Australia. And Jackie True is like a real expert on women, peace and security. She and a team of researchers surveyed individuals across Indonesia, the Philippines and Bangladesh, I believe, and looked into beliefs in misogyny and how that could be an indicator of extremism. And they found that holding misogynistic beliefs made someone 3 times more likely to support extremist ideology, and it was a greater determinant than your religious background, family background. I believe financial status was the third point, but either way it was a very big determinant in if someone would support extremism, essentially.
Yeah. Well, I think it's true though, isn't it? A lot of the extremist individuals that that we see across the world, and even in Western societies with groups like incels and things like that. Misogyny often comes first, right? It's the first step in that route to it, and I think is a really good indicator of like potential something brewing in society that could lead to a conflict. And I think, yeah, again, it comes up again and again in our research that we've done, that these men that are perpetrating these kind of violent acts across the world do also come home and do violent acts against the women in the household as well.
We're speaking about men engaging in misogyny, but I think, as Adam was just saying, this is a problem that people are maybe looking at in the wider PCV space at the moment, which is maybe how even some women might be seen in traditionally misogynistic spaces. So you're talking about how it could be a gateway into potentially the extreme right wing. And for example, someone was telling me last week about some like this trad wives movement, where people are kind of, I don't know, putting out a lifestyle content, but actually subtly speaking towards sort of right-wing extremist messages. So I'm interested in, have you seen anything like this in Southeast Asia as well, where women are also potentially perpetuating misogynistic or gender violence or this kind of narratives, and how that would play into extremism in this space?
That's a really interesting question, and I think that, like, yes, it is true that it's really important to also think about how women are contributing to promoting these very traditional norms as well. I'd say in Southeast Asia, I know I did some research on women involved in Islamist extremist groups, and I remember looking more into how their roles have changed slightly. I mean, they're very active within these groups, but because of kind of the wider access of the internet, essentially, they've been able to kind of use that to promote extremist ideology from their own homes and become a bit more active, and also bankroll. So some women actually bankrolled in part the Battle of Marawi in the Philippines in 2017. So there's definitely a sense that they're becoming more active in those positions and in extremist groups, or have become more active. I think now extremism in the region was on a bit of a decline, and so I don't want to kind of, I don't know how much of a problem it continues to be, but they certainly had become kind of more active in promoting extremist ideology because of this ability to do it from within the home. And I think you saw the same thing among women who joined the Islamic State as well. In terms of promoting traditional gender ideology, a lot of the kind of messaging that's promoted to women in Indonesia, for instance, for Islamist extremism, focuses very much on kind of empowerment, but also maintaining motherhood as well. And so that's a really interesting topic, and I think more research should be done.
And you mentioned at the top of the podcast about some of your work, how you like and choose to use it for prevention, for looking ahead, and how gender is a really helpful predictor for some of the trends that do come. So for people like ourselves, like researchers, practitioners, if you were thinking about interventions, so if you're imagining, like you said, some of these people that might be vulnerable to extremism or that might be perpetuating it through funding or, as you've just mentioned, how can we get ahead of the curve? How can we look at some of these predictors and learn from them?
Yeah, so I think probably, a really good predictor, and I think a well-known predictor, is using or observing rates of gender-based violence in local communities, because that's been shown to be an indicator of an increased extremist activity. So offering women a way of reporting gender-based violence is a really useful indicator and can help us kind of know where extremist activity might be increasing. Just being aware of some of the stereotypes around how we prevent and counter extremism. So how are women being understood? Are they being understood as, okay, well, we're just going to ask them to go and prevent people from their communities from joining extremist groups, or we're going to ask them to be mothers and watch their son's behaviour and prevent him from becoming radicalised? Or are we going to actually listen to them and learn more about them and whether they actually end up becoming involved in extremism as well? So I think there was a study on Malaysia which said that, which found that mothers there were actually kind of vectors of extremism to their children within the home. And so it's just really important to be aware of what the reality is, essentially, and how much your perception of gender is influencing and maybe damaging the efforts you're creating to try and prevent it. And then aside from that, like what I was saying before, just trying to look into the kind of gendered traits within the extremist ideology. I suppose looking at kind of far-right extremism, for instance, there is a tendency to encourage men to join on the basis that they're going to protect women from their women, or, you know, quote unquote, their women and children from a kind of external force that's, you know, going to, erode their community. And this has been used by kind of genocidal entities, by governments, by extremist groups, etc. And so being aware of the gendered messaging and how, for instance, with that messaging, it can attract men. It can also attract women because it can play on their fears, you know, that they're going to face gender-based violence as well. So that's really important. I also think conformity and obedience are seen as way more important than ideology alone. And I think that the extremist field in general is quite behind on this. Like, they just focus so much on ideology. And I think that the reason I'm bringing this up and talking about gender is that, you know, when I'm talking about these things like protective, you know, promoting or tapping into the ideal sort of gender expectation that men will protect women in their community, I don't know if there's like a very clear link between that and why someone engages in violence, as in they might be swept up into the violence. But I think essentially there needs to be more research, way more research into that connection, that kind of gap between gender and ideology and men and women actually committing violence or joining an extremist group and contributing to it.
When it comes to communities or international organisations that kind of come into this space that are looking to bring positive change for women and girls in conflict zones, where do you think we should start, or they should start?
I'd say the most important thing is to engage local, like grassroots women's organisations who have a much better understanding of the kind of local landscape in terms of security, but also in terms of gender dynamics as well. And they're often like very keen to address, it's their kind of MO to address these things and their whole objective of having a group, but they maybe don't have the funding there to implement a kind of big, large-scale project. So I think, the most important thing is consulting local organisations, definitely. And I do think there is more of a turn towards doing this among WPS scholars, certainly, or like a question around, okay, is the WPS agenda coming from the global north? Is it really fit for purpose for global south countries? Does it incorporate everyone? It doesn't really recognise necessarily that there are intersecting inequalities, and that might affect, like how it's actually, whether it's going to help people and the extent to which it can help people, and that women aren't just one block. And so I think there is definitely more of a conversation around this now. And I think the only solution, having worked in it, that I would suggest is or the clearest solution at least, is just consulting and working with those local organisations for sure.
Yeah, I think like in your work you kind of touch on a lot of that, where you talk about how women's civil and political engagement often increases in conflict zones or in war-torn areas, and often come together to form civil organisations. So maybe the route to providing a solution to this is, like you said, just engaging with those natural organic groups that are coming up, and just give them a platform and give them the opportunity. And again, we see that in our research. We see women coming together and kind of organising, but it's difficult to break through when you may be in a very misogynistic environment where it isn't open to giving women the opportunity to talk about it or to have that platform.
So since we're talking about international agendas and donor support and some of these things, I'd like to come to the election.
Okay.
So it's fresh off the press, obviously we're all still digesting, but in 2021 you did write about the then Biden Harris administration and how they had really tried to address women, peace and security. Now, it seems quite timely, we're only 24 hours later, but given that we're just looking at the exit of a now Harris administration, what reflections do you have sort of fresh out of the gate on this topic?
Yeah, so that was written, there was a lot of like hope in the air, very different moment in time. Basically, me and my the co-author, who was a colleague of mine, we were trying to look at what the Biden-Harris administration were planning to do in terms of promoting women, so kind of leading by example. So what were they doing domestically, and how that might, because obviously the US is so visible to other countries, how that might influence other countries. For instance, having the first woman vice president, having a cabinet that was made up of many women as well. So we were looking at that side of things, like the symbolic side or signalling side, if you like, of what they were doing. But we were also looking at how are they actually integrating gender into their foreign policy, and how might that directly affect countries in the Indo-Pacific. And we found, obviously, like I say, there was so much hope around what they were going to introduce. They were focusing on only providing funding to a lot of schemes that also address gender-based violence for international programs. And so this was a big part of their kind of agenda on women internationally. And I think another big part of what we were looking at as well was kind of the climate agenda. And obviously Trump had not been hugely a big promoter of kind of trying to address climate change. And Biden did actually rejoin the Paris Agreement. And so the reason we looked at that specifically, at climate change specifically, is because the Indo-Pacific is really affected by climate-related disasters, and it's getting worse and worse, and that also directly affects women. And so we were just curious about what he was doing in that domain. And yeah, it was a very, like I say, quite hopeful time. The US WPS National Action Plan, Women, Peace and Security National Action Plan, was actually passed under Trump. And so it was kind of seen as like, oh, well, that's quite weird that he did that. But then now I just think, well, there's just nothing redeeming because of the abortion issue. Like if you're going to systematically erode women's reproductive rights in your own country, it kind of it's not irrelevant what you do internationally, but it just undermines what you do internationally so much that I can't even see any, right now, positives or kind of, redeeming factors in what he might do. And so that's my opinion on that, yeah.
I think, like you say, obviously, US domestic politics is its own thing, but in terms of the regions that you're working on, how much do you think this is going to impact sort of US's policy on the world, their openness to looking at some of these international agendas in the Indo-Pacific, which, is their backyard in many ways, but he has spoken a lot about a turn inwards. So what are your potential concerns and hopes for the WPS agenda in the Indo-Pacific?
So again, I think I can probably only speak about what he did last time he was in office. And I think, although there is, he's quite isolationist in some ways, I think there is just continued focus on the Indo-Pacific, and that won't change. The US is obviously very kind of scared about China. Maybe scared is not fair to say, but, they're constantly focused on China, and I think that won't change at all under Trump. Yeah, I mean, like I say, he did pass the WPS agenda. I think that was mainly Ivanka actually pushing that through.
Which is interesting, isn't it? How one of the key women in Trump's life was the one that may have pushed that, right?
Yeah. I'm not sure if he would have done it just if he didn't have a daughter, yeah.
I was just going to say, since you mentioned in passing the impact of climate change, and you mentioned how Trump's policies towards climate change are potentially slightly different, and how this really intersects with the impact on women in the Indo-Pacific and in other regions. I thought maybe we could turn to climate change and see sort of how that intersects with your research on gender, how you tie the two approaches together to start with, and any examples that you have from the Indo-Pacific.
Yeah, so in terms of women, I think there's kind of two ways that it affects women. The first is that climate change can lead to or increase the likelihood of conflict because of things like conflict over resources. So I was actually involved in a project with a strategic communications organisation where we looked into whether water shortage in Somalia was leading to resource conflict around water sources, and we found that it actually was. And so I think that this is kind of a major concern, the fact that shortages and climate change will lead to greater conflict, which in turn obviously affects women's rights and also the safety of women and girls more generally. And then there's the climate-related disasters themselves and how that leads to things like an erosion of social structures that are in place to protect women and girls, and also displacement, which again exposes or leaves girls and women vulnerable to gender-based violence in displaced settings especially, but also it's well known that in displaced settings the rate of intimate partner violence actually increases as well. And so there's this risk present too. There's also just things like the physical difficulties that then make it harder for women who are already a little bit more confined to the private sphere to be even more confined. So, like, let's say the road to get to your school is blocked because there's been flooding, then that kind of makes it difficult for girls to get education. And so there's all these issues around physical kind of movement and mobility, I'd say, that will and do affect women and girls uniquely. But yeah, having said that, with the kind of rising or the increasing use of AI and tech, there are examples where things like educational tools can be delivered to girls remotely, so they can still kind of pursue an education. They don't have to be there in person, so long as they have internet access. Also, and one thing I didn't touch on was women's reproductive rights. So again, it's difficult for them to physically get to a sort of health centre if their kind of road has been blocked by flooding, or if they're in displaced settings, it might be difficult for them to leave. And there are now examples of using drones and things in Rwanda for telehealth and to deliver prescriptions to people. So I do think that we are kind of on the cusp, or actually already in kind of technological revolution, and I think there is a way of using that for good, and hopefully it's not all kind of despair, and and we're able to somewhat mitigate the after effects of these issues.
So what advice would you give young aspiring professionals, researchers and policymakers who want to make an impact in this field and maybe kind of follow the route that you've taken yourself? What would you give them?
Yeah, so I think the first point probably is to be like confident in, I mean, this is such generic advice, but like I think it's really easy to kind of have like imposter syndrome or feel like what you're saying isn't actually that valuable. Noting, not fighting, but just noting like how you're talking to yourself and whether you're like putting yourself down or your knowledge down, and remaining aware of that, I think is really important. I'd say also like networking, and this is a bit of a change in topic, I guess, more on a practical level. Networking is really, really important in this field. It's really important. I think that it's something that I've tried to do a lot, and I'm also I really don't enjoy big group situations where everyone's like trying to scramble for the most important quote unquote like person in the room. So I'd say for me personally, I reach out to people one-to-one who I want to connect with, and I find that a lot easier, and then I'll maybe have a coffee with them, and I think this is a really useful way of kind of building up a good network. And then sometimes opportunities arise, and it comes through that network for you to work with somewhere or do some research on a certain topic or research with a co-author. For me personally, I listen to like podcasts pretty much like every day, covering like a single issue in depth. And I think that's really useful for engaging with something. And you don't have to sit down and read like The Economist back to back, but just maintaining awareness of all the conversations that are going on out there and how that might influence your work and broaden your mind as well. And you can kind of, sometimes you can hear something and you're like, oh, actually that really relates to my work or something I want to research, and so I can bring this to somewhere and ask them if I can, research it through them. I think also just being like flexible and not focusing on getting into like the perfect position straight away. So I spoke to someone not long ago who was asking for advice on how to kind of break into the policy field, and they said, and they just finished their masters, I think, and they said like, oh, I've just been applying to like really sort of elite level organizations, I guess you could say, so like the UN, World Health Organization, blah, blah, blah. And I think, this is, you don't have to like go for these like really, like you can just, like, I think there's so many really good organizations out there doing really great work, like loads, and it doesn't have to be this, like the UN. You can, make a dent and do research and actually maybe have more of a role in shaping somewhere in the research it does by going for somewhere that's maybe a bit smaller, or like, in a role that maybe is a bit different to what you'd expect, and adjusting and learning and kind of growing into a role that fits you better or you feel fits yourself.
No, I think that's great advice. Yeah. And I guess what you were saying about networking, if anyone does want to reach out to you or kind of follow up on anything you're doing, what would be the best way to do so?
So if you want to reach out, my email and LinkedIn will be in the show notes.
Perfect.
Okay.
No, that's great. And I guess any other questions for you?
And for me.
No. Well, thank you, Jennifer, for sharing your insights with us today. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us in this deep dive into women in conflict. Be sure to subscribe to I2's Innovation and Insight series for more conversations that cut through the noise and reveal critical narratives shaping our world. And until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.